The conflict tactics scale was developed by Strauss-Murray in 1979. The conflict tactics scales are the most widely used instrument for identifying domestic violence. The scales are based on the premise that conflict is an inevitable aspect of all human association, but that the use of coercion, including force and violence as a conflict resolution tactic, is harmful. Conflict management, or what for purposes of the conflict tactics scale is called conflict tactics, refers to the method used to resolve the conflict. Two families can have the same conflict but differ vastly, and with profound consequences in how they deal with these conflicts. One family might resolve the issue of which TV program to watch by rotation, another by first one there, and another by threat of force by the physically strongest. There are two main versions of the CTS. The CTS-2, an expanded and modified version of the original, by Strauss, Hamby, Boney, McCoy, and Sugarman, is the version measuring violence against a partner in a dating, cohabitating, or marital relationship. The CTS-2 has scales to measure victimization and perpetration of three tactics that are often used in conflicts between partners: physical assault, psychological aggression, and negotiation, and scales to measure injury and sexual coercion of and by a partner. Each of the five categories is then further subdivided into two subscales. Negotiation is subdivided into cognitive and emotional, while the other four categories are subdivided into minor and severe. There are 6 items in negotiation, 12 in physical assault, 8 in psychological aggression, 7 in sexual coercion, and 6 in injury. The Parent-Child Conflict Tactics Scale is the version of the CTS for measuring maltreatment of a child by parents. The CTS-PC has scales to measure physical assault with subscales for corporal punishment and physical abuse, psychological aggression, and use of non-violent discipline techniques. There are also supplementary questions on neglect, sexual abuse, and discipline in the past week. The revised conflict tactics scales are based on data obtained from students about their relationship to a partner in a dating, cohabitating, or marital relationship. Preliminary research on a student sample was a useful strategy in developing the conflict tactics scales. 1. The factor structure of the student data, for example, is very similar to the factor structure later found for national and clinical samples. The findings to be reported are also valuable because students are a large and important population who are often victims or perpetrators of partner violence. Numerous studies show that the 12-month prevalence rate of dating violence is 25 to 30%, which is almost double the 16% rate for married couples. It is important to have an instrument that is applicable to this substantial population that is a high risk of partner violence. 541 questionnaires in undergraduate sociology and criminal justice classes in 2 colleges in the spring of 1995 were distributed. Participants were told that they could omit any question they did not wish to answer, and that they could omit the entire questionnaire by putting the blank questionnaire in the box at the front of the room when other students started handing in their questionnaires. 15 students chose not to answer the questionnaire. Participants who were not 18 or older, or who did not have a heterosexual dating, cohabitating, or marital relationship of at least 1 month duration during the previous year were not included in the analysis. In addition, cases were deleted if there were missing data for even one of the many variables needed for the conflict tactics scales and several other scales. A total of 317 participants met these criteria. As expected, this is primarily a sample of young dating couples. The participants were asked to describe their current relationship, or if no current relationship, the most recent one. About 2/3 responded to the conflict tactics scales about a current relationship. Participants tended to come from well-educated families. Over half of their fathers and over a third of their mothers had completed a 4-year college degree. The conflict tactics scale can be administered in many ways, including in-person interview, telephone interview, self-administered questionnaire, and computer-administered questionnaire. The testing time for the full conflict tactics scale 2 is 12 to 15 minutes. An alternative is to administer only the 3 core scales: physical assault, psychological aggression, and negotiation. This produces an instrument that has the same coverage and takes about the same time as the original CTS, which is 7 to 10 minutes. A second alternative is to use the conflict tactics scale 2 short form by Strauss and Douglas, for which testing time is approximately 3 minutes. Both of these alternatives have important limitations. The first alternative means no data on injury and sexual coercion. The second alternative obtains information on all 5 scales, but at the cost of detecting only about half as many cases as when the full-length scales are used. There are many ways to score the conflict tactic scale. Each is suited to different circumstances. Common scoring methods include prevalence, which is simply an indication of whether any one or more of the acts in the scale have been committed. Frequency is the number of times the behavior occurred in the past year. Severity level classifies each case into three categories: none, minor only, or severe. The mutuality types classify each case as respondent only, partner only, or both. The mutuality types may be particularly useful in couples therapy because over 100 studies have found that when there is violence, 50% or more of the time it is by both partners. Alpha coefficients of reliability for the conflict tactic scales, too, reported in 41 articles, are tabulated in Strauss 2005. The coefficients ranged from 0.34 to 0.94, with a mean of 0.77. A study of the CTS2 in 17 nations found similar results in Strauss 2004. The occasional low alpha coefficient occurred when the behavior measured by some of the items, such as attacking a partner with a knife or gun, was absent or nearly absent in some samples. There are less data on the internal consistency reliability of the conflict tactic scales parent-child because this instrument is less widely used. In the 7 articles which provided reliability data, the alpha coefficients ranged from 0.25 to 0.92 with a mean of 0.64. The coefficients below the convention of 0.7t are for 7 violent subscale and reflect the near zero rate of extremely abusive acts in the same samples. The steps to achieving content validity included developing the questions on the basis of qualitative interviews and suggestions and reviews by experienced researchers and clinicians. Each question is based around an example of the behavior being measured, such as punching a partner or a child. For punching to be invalid, it would be necessary to conclude that it is not an act of violence. Like most tests, the conflict tactic scales includes only a sample of the universe of possible violent acts. This is analogous to a spelling test that includes only a sample of the total number of words that a child in the 7th grade should know how to spell. Although the behaviors in the conflict tactic scales may be valid, the method used to select behaviors to include in the conflict tactic scales did not guarantee that they are an adequate sample of violent behaviors. One indication that they are an adequate sample comes from a study of Dobash and Dobash in 1984, who are among the most strident critics of the CTS. They used qualitative methods to identify typical violent acts. Their list of violent acts is almost identical to the items in the CTS. In revising the conflict tactic scales, the authors kept the vocabulary and sentence structure simple to make it applicable to a broad section of the population. It was found to only require a 6th grade reading ability, and in addition, it is likely to be usable with many cultural groups because conflict tactic scales 1 has been used with several U.S. ethnic groups and in other nations, and the conflict tactic scales 2 is very similar to the former. Given the limitations of conflict tactic scales, when extending this measurement to a new population, care must be taken to ensure that results are interpreted with the utmost concern for cross-cultural effects. The conflict tactic scale is both the most widely used measure of family violence and also the most widely criticized. The most frequent criticism reflect ideological differences rather than empirical evidence. Specifically, many feminist scholars reject the conflict tactic scale because studies using this instrument find that about the same percentage of women as men assault their partners. This contradicts the feminist theory that partner violence is almost exclusively committed by men as a means to dominate women, and is therefore taken as prima facie evidence that the conflict tactic scale is not valid. Ironically, the fact that the conflict tactic scale has provided some of the best evidence confirming the link between male dominance and partner violence and other key aspects of feminist theory of partner violence has not shaken the belief that the conflict tactic scale is invalid. The brevity of the conflict tactic scale makes its use possible in situations which preclude a longer instrument. However, its brevity is also a limitation because it means that the subscales are limited to distinguishing minor and severe levels of each of the tactics. For example, with only 8 items, the psychological aggression scale cannot provide subscales for separate dimensions such as rejecting, isolation, terrorizing, ignoring, and corrupting. Every measuring instrument has limitations and problems, and the conflict tactic scale is no exception. So these limitations need to be considered when interpreting results from the conflict tactic scale or when choosing an instrument to measure family violence. Fortunately, there are comprehensive Compedia which describe over 100 measures of different aspects of violence, and they facilitate examining alternatives to the conflict tactic scale or choosing additional instruments to measure aspects of violence that are not covered by it. Overall, Strauss gave us a tool to look behind closed doors and created a measure which lit a fire to the domestic violence field. The conflict tactic scale was revolutionary because it allowed researchers to quantitatively study events that had often been ignored culturally and typically took place in private. I definitely will use it when routinely evaluating couples for domestic violence.